Greetings. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, The Protagoras. I'm Keith Whitaker. The Protagoras is one of the few Platonic dialogues that present Socrates conversing with a truly famous man. Protagoras, the man, was known as a sophist. Indeed, the ancient subtitle of this dialogue is On Sophists. The sophists were teachers, but they were more like TED Talk stars than obscure academicians. They combined cutting-edge research with political skill. They traveled from city to city, earning huge fees for their teaching. As Protagoras says in this dialogue, he taught his students how best to manage their households and how to be most powerful in speaking and acting in their cities. In other words, he taught them how to make money and influence people. The sophists made science practical and politically relevant. In that, they resemble today's entrepreneurs, business leaders, and intellectuals. But there's a great difference between the sophists' place in the ancient world and innovators in today's world. Today, people celebrate practical science and technology. Society thrives on innovation. In contrast, in Protagoras' time, sophists had to watch their step. Yes, they were praised by rich groupies, such as the wealthy young man Callias, who hosts Protagoras in this discussion. Yes, they could command large fees from their fans. And yet the title sophist carried a bad reputation. Even Callias's lowly doorman, a eunuch, despises the sophists who his master has in the house. Reading Protagoras, then, offers us a chance to ask what had to change in science as well as in politics to transform suspected sophists into famous intellectuals, or to transform sophistry into the science that appears to rule our world. Now, the dialogue, The Protagoras, falls into three main parts. The first part is a brief dramatic exchange between Socrates and an unnamed companion, in which Socrates offers to repeat to the companion the conversation that he had had with Protagoras earlier that same day. In the second part, Socrates begins his narration. He recounts how a young Athenian named Hippocrates came to his house early that morning and asked Socrates to introduce him to Protagoras. The third, and by far the longest part of the dialogue, consists of Socrates' narration of his dialogue with Protagoras, which took place at the home of Callias. Now, before jumping into that third part, that longest part, let's observe a curious feature that connects the dialogue's beginning with its end. As I mentioned, Protagoras, the dialogue, opens with Socrates engaged in small talk with a companion, to whom he offers to narrate the whole dialogue, which he says took place earlier that day. Now, Socrates must have spent the next few hours narrating the dialogue to his companion. But at the end of the dialogue itself, the dialogue he had with Protagoras that morning, Socrates said that he could not stay to talk further because he had to go take care of some important business. Clearly, there was no important business. Plato shows us Socrates in a blatant lie. Now, before we decide that the Protagoras offers a stark example of Socrates' injustice, let's also consider why Socrates visited Protagoras that morning in the first place. He did so, he says, for Hippocrates, not for his own sake. Hippocrates, as we see in the dialogue, is a bold, rich young man. He wants to learn the art of managing households and cities. He believes that he can learn that art from Protagoras, but he needs an introduction, he says. Now, Socrates, in turn, gives him a warning. How does he know that what he'll learn from Protagoras won't cause him harm? He doesn't. So, Socrates offers to accompany Hippocrates to Protagoras, not just to introduce the young man, but also to protect him. In other words, here in the Protagoras, Socrates appears as a guardian of the young. Protagoras appears as the potential corrupter. Now, many years later, the city of Athens will prosecute Socrates and execute him on the grounds that he corrupted the young. This dialogue, like really all of the dialogues, is part of Plato's defense of Socrates' virtue. Now, to turn to the dialogue itself. Once he and Socrates begin speaking at Callias's house, Protagoras announces that if he takes Hippocrates on as a student, he will make him better every day by teaching him good counsel, both in business and in politics. In Socrates' words, Protagoras teaches the political art. Now, Socrates challenges Protagoras and says that he, Socrates, does not think that this art is teachable. Protagoras in turn defends his profession with a long and very beautiful myth. Now, this myth rewards careful study, but its main teaching, if we sum it up, is that human beings owe their well-being to their own efforts and to their own arts, not to the gods. In particular, he teaches, political life rests on certain social virtues, such as justice and holiness, which encourage people to put others' goods in front of their own. Now, Protagoras says that almost all grown-ups teach these social virtues in a sort of rough and ready way. Sophists, such as Protagoras, take that teaching to another level. In short, then, Protagoras manages to affirm the would-be wisdom of parents and his own wisdom in one myth, which is no small achievement. Hippocrates and Hippocrates' fat fee seem to be his for the taking. But then something very curious happens. Socrates begins to question Protagoras about the virtues that he mentioned, justice and holiness, and related virtues, such as moderation and wisdom. To make a long story short, through his questions, Socrates reveals that Protagoras has no idea whether these virtues are one or many, separable or inseparable. Protagoras is actually confused about what virtue is. He's confused about the very core of his so-called art. He did not proceed with good counsel for himself here. So, what kind of teacher of good counsel could he be? By the end of the dialogue, the great Protagoras is thoroughly frustrated. Hippocrates leaves with Socrates. Now, if Protagoras were a mere windbag, this defeat would not be very meaningful. However, if you look closely at his myth, not to mention his own writings, or Socrates' discussion of Protagoras' teachings in the Theaetetus, you'll see that Protagoras was a very impressive thinker and speaker. His defeat is not due to mere thoughtlessness. So what is it due to? The key lies in what Protagoras emphasizes here as his uniqueness. In his opening speech, Protagoras claims descent from a long line of sophists. But, he says, they all hid their sophistry. They pretended to be other things, poets, orators, or the like. What makes Protagoras unique, he says, is that he is truthful about his profession. He is a sophist, and he boldly admits it. Indeed, he even named his book, The Truth. We should note that Protagoras' stance about his wisdom differs greatly from Socrates' stance about his own. In his own long speech later in the dialogue, Socrates claims descent from a line of philosophers who concealed their wisdom behind pithy sayings. Protagoras, in other words, claims to be a revealer, Socrates a concealer. If we think about these two positions a little more closely, we can see that Protagoras' position implies that philosophy or science is fundamentally compatible with political life. The sophist brings to completion the rudimentary teaching that we all begin to learn by living in society. Socrates' position, in contrast, implies that philosophy or science is always in tension with the political community. Now, this is not to say that Protagoras the man is an open book. Someone who claims only to tell the truth probably has something up his sleeve. He claims to be more candid than he actually is. For example, his famous myth is clearly invented. He has dressed up his political teachings in a mythological guise. As he himself says, he practices caution. At the same time, Protagoras clearly thinks that sophistry is not only compatible with politics, but should even rule. So, to win students and adherents, he hints at and even advertises sophistry's superiority. Now that is incautious. Protagoras shows his hand most when he boasts of filling Greece with his name. He wants to be superior, which requires smarts, but also publicity. To use two terms that are crucial to his conversation with Socrates, Protagoras seeks to combine wisdom and courage. But when Socrates shows, late in the dialogue, that all the virtues can be reduced to forms of wisdom and to a sort of art of measuring, as he calls it, Protagoras is clearly repulsed. Ultimately, Protagoras enjoys daring more than insight. Now, to be clear, Protagoras' defeat in the Protagoras, the dialogue, is not a defeat of sophistry simply. After all, the dialogue is subtitled On Sophists, not On Sophistry. And Plato devoted another entire dialogue to the subject of the sophist. Rather, Protagoras reveals the internal tensions of the life of the sophist as lived by its most preeminent representative. Likewise, it contrasts this life with the life of the philosopher, Socrates, who, despite reducing virtue to forms of wisdom, steadfastly claims that virtue is not teachable. In its own way, Protagoras shows Socrates' combination of wisdom, moderation, and justice. Courage appears less prominently in Socrates' character. Now, our own society exhibits every day the charm of Protagoras' daring, restless spirit. Perhaps we would benefit precisely from reflecting on the quieter appeal of Socrates' more laconic stance. If so, the Protagoras is a good place to begin. I hope you found this brief introduction helpful. Again, this is Keith Whitaker at Wise Counsel Research.